IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. Do you remember last year when we spoke about how the Intel vPro platform is built for business? Well, I'm glad to say we've kicked it up a notch. That's right, Intel is back with a new and improved version of the platform. The new Intel vPro platform lets you do more of what you want and less of what you don't. So it's better for you and for your IT teams, who really are the backbone of keeping your work-from-home experience easy and enjoyable. I can safely say that the new vPro platform gives you more enterprise efficiency with less constraints. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can get more done with less waiting. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me my colleagues Pranay Kotasthane and Aditya Ramanathan, and we're going to be discussing something that's been talked about in sort of media for the last more than a few years, at least since sort of Trump's election in the US. The idea that the US aided and abetted China's rise as a great power. And of course, in Trump's view, that was done foolishly. And there's been so much conversation about, how the engagement policy was a failure. The US failed to anticipate China's aggressive or even potentially malicious intents. And we're going to be talking about all of this in the context of a book that my colleague Aditya says is the best IR book that he's read in the recent times. The book is Over the Horizon, Time, Uncertainty, and the Rise of Great Powers by David Edelstein. So Aditya, firstly, I want to come to you and ask you, why do you think this is the best book that you've read in recent times in IR?
The boring answer would be that, it combines both substantial theory and empirical study, which is not all that easy in every IR book. And you come out of the book feeling like you've learned something or understood something, or you feel like you've been challenged to rethink some of your assumptions. The more interesting answer, the more personal answer, is that it answered something, or attempted to answer something that's been a puzzle in my mind as well, which is, why did the US aid and abet the rise of China? Was the US just being foolish? Like a lot of other people in IR and strategy, I read John Mearsheimer fairly early, the book Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And Mearsheimer very much in that book advocated that the US should actually limit the economic rise of China. And he has, in subsequent years, he basically said that the US was misguided in its approach towards China. And, this was because of, American commitment to liberal internationalism and so on. I was not myself entirely convinced by that argument. And I think this book gave a very interesting and fairly convincing explanation for why cooperation occurs between existing powers and rising powers.
So he talks about a framework where, time plays a role in terms of how existing great powers and rising powers things approach each other. And he gives certain examples, right? I mean, if I was reading correctly, he gives 4 examples of where, so we'd commonly assume that there would be, conflict would be inevitable and the incumbent would want to stymie the rise of a rising power. Yet he talks about different examples where that's not really the case, right? Aditya, could you tell us a little bit about the examples that he cites?
Sure, I will. And, the case studies that he provides are very well done, by the standards of political science. It's very well researched, it's nuanced. But before I get to those case studies, let me just try and explain what he means when he talks about time horizons. Edelstein makes the case that because there is uncertainty about the future, a state does not know exactly how to respond to a rising power. So if you ask John Mearsheimer, he, in 2001, when he argued in the book Tragedy of Great Power Politics that, China was going to be the next major challenge to the United States, he was making that assumption that it would be so. On the other hand, in 2001, it was not necessarily evident. You did not know if the Chinese Communist Party and its regime would last. You did not know if China would take a more liberal direction, if its economic rise would falter. All of these things, there was great uncertainty about the future. Now, if you were to prepare for the worst every time, it's going to be expensive. It might be wasteful. On the other hand, if you were to try and gauge the intentions of the other state and understand what it really wants, you might not necessarily prepare for the worst. The other thing is that thinking about the future requires a long-term horizon. But if China is focused on the long term, as the rising state, it has an interest in, as Deng Xiaoping said, hiding your capabilities and biding your time. It has an interest in reassuring existing powers that it does not pose a threat, that it can be incorporated into the existing world system, and so on. I think there is a fair amount of evidence that in the 90s and early 2000s, China was doing pretty much that. It was providing reassurance to the United States. And on the other hand, the United States was looking at it from a more short-term perspective. They will, from their perspective, since they didn't know exactly how China's rise was going to pan out, in the short term, it offered them opportunities to make money, to have trade with China. And, that trade is huge. It's transformed America's own economy. It's benefited America's consumers massively. So there was a very clear self-interest for the United States to engage China before it was clear exactly what the rise of China would mean. And, so this in a sense answers the basic question that we had, which is, until the end of the Cold War, the US had a reason to engage with China. From the Sino-Soviet split in 1969 to about 1991, China acted as a balancer against the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union had fallen, using Mearsheimer's model, you would have begun to balance against China. On the other hand, because you did not know what China's prospects were, it made sense to hedge and seek pragmatic short-term benefits. Now, the 4 case studies that he talks about, they're quite interesting. The first one is he starts in the 19th century, looking at Germany under Otto von Bismarck, starting in 1871, once the German Empire had been consolidated. Germany, sat right in the middle of Europe. Its constant concern was a two-front war from both the East and the West, and it was surrounded by enemies or potential enemies. So it made sense for the Germans to basically entangle all these countries in a series of alliances, coalitions, so that Germany does not have to face threats from multiple fronts simultaneously. And, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but Bismarck's policies really helped Germany stabilize relations with these countries. He continued cultivating the Russians, and even with Germany's traditional enemy, France, he found avenues of short-term cooperation. Just like how, we see the US seeking short-term cooperation with China, he sought short-term cooperation with the French. He would, for instance, provide diplomatic backing to France's imperial adventures. So this made a lot of sense for Germany as it continued to rise, as it continued to consolidate its power. Of course, after 1890, Bismarck was out of power. Kaiser Wilhelm took over. Now, I'm not sure that this is entirely based on what personalities do, but, by then, Germany's strategic situation had changed, and eventually it did go to war in 1914. The second case study that Edelstein provides is again in the late 19th century, and it may actually be the most interesting of all of them because this is about a peaceful power transition. We are often told that these peaceful power transitions are fairly rare, and that is true. But perhaps the most remarkable peaceful power transition in modern history is the one in the late 19th century and early 20th century, where power transitioned from Great Britain to the United States. And this was not necessarily something that was foreordained. Yes, it is true. Edelstein agrees that, the idea of having common culture, shared ethnicity, and so on did help in bringing the two sides closer together and did allow the British to believe that the Americans had benign intentions. But really what drove this peaceful transition was the fact that both sides were seeking short-term benefits of their own. While the Americans were enforcing the Monroe Doctrine and basically driving the British out of both North America and South America, the two countries also had found avenues of cooperation. Firstly, the biggest, most immediate threat at that time to the British was, of course, Germany. Secondly, for example, the US went and took over the Philippines. The British were not necessarily all that concerned because from their perspective, American trade policies were quite suited to their own. And so it made sense for Americans to control the Philippines rather than some other European power, which would likely be a rival. Similarly, in return, the Americans gave support to the British over the Boer War. So, there were avenues of short-term cooperation between the two countries that allowed them to not enter a face-off and allow for a peaceful transition. The third example that Edelstein provides is between the two world wars, where again, Germany found itself in that same difficult strategic position and once again tried for a couple of decades to balance off threats, to find avenues of short-term cooperation, most evidently with the Soviet Union, until that system once again collapsed and you had the Second World War. And the fourth example is, of course, the birth of the Cold War. Over here, Edelstein admits that, once you have a structural bipolar system, it's very difficult for two countries to not engage in competition, to not engage in a rivalry. But he does point out to some specific events, the Berlin crisis, obviously, but also diplomatic goings-on in both Turkey and Iran that changed American perceptions about, rightly or wrongly, changed American perceptions about the Soviet Union and led to the Cold War. Yeah, so that's broadly the four examples that he gives.
That's fascinating. I think you touched on so many interesting issues, and I want to pick up some of these with Pranay. Pranay, firstly, let's there's a talk about personalities. There's talk about this time horizon business, and there's also talk about how structural changes can lead to certain different outcomes, and how when sort of a rising power and a great power, incumbent great powers find commonalities in certain senses, they may be able to work together better. So, Pranay, let's apply this to and you've done this in your newsletter where you've tried to apply this framework of time horizon to the US-China rivalry. And Aditya spoke about how, short-term perspectives probably led to cooperation in the early parts of the 2000s. How does this sort of play out subsequently, and why are we where we are today based on this framework?
So before I get started, Manoj, I just want to thank Aditya for recommending this book, first of all, because it was a good read. And I think the important point here was, and why I also liked the book was, like Aditya was saying, we were talking about liberal internationalism of US and China's time, and the post-2001 sort of partial competition where there was competition plus cooperation happening. And I was always wondering, why was, in spite of US's intellectual horsepower, why weren't they able to look at this incoming superpowers rise much earlier? India has been going on about this for a long time. And I was searching for answers which were particularistic to the US scenario, right? Yeah, liberal internationalism, they wanted China to change. That's why they brought in WTO, etc. But the fascinating part about this book was it put things into perspective and made me realize that that's not the case, that it is specific to US. In fact, it is the default case that generally existing great powers end up cooperating with and actually aiding and abetting their own rival instead of actually preventing their rise. So that's the default case, not an exception. So that was what I was fascinated about. Now let's look at it from the current side, right? So let me just put this framework in perspective so that we can understand this better. So it's a 2x2 and it's difficult to explain it on an audio, but yeah. We can try. Okay, so just imagine there are each of the countries can have time horizons. Okay, time horizons essentially mean that whether they are focused on the now and let's say 2-3 years down the line, or whether their vision is 20-30 years down the line. That would be a long time horizon. Now, if you look at two powers, now we are only looking at a dyad, not bringing all the powers in the picture, but just look at two powers. One is an existing great power, one is an emerging great power. Now, you will have two time horizons for both of them. So basically, you will end up with four scenarios where there will be short term horizons, there will be long, short, long, and long, right? There will be like four combinations. Now, this is what's interesting. So what he says is that when a country, the existing, when a rising superpower is focused on the long term, okay, that means they are not upsetting the apple cart in the short term. They are hiding their capabilities, biding their time kind of a mode. And when that happens, it actually is more likely that the existing superpower will focus on the short term. Okay, so they will more look at what can happen now and then. Are there opportunities for cooperation? Are there opportunities for short-term gains? So this is an interesting part. That is what exists and conditions are conducive for cooperation. Now, this is what I guess was happening between US and China through the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, because this was the time when China was sort of adopting this HIDA capacities by the time, famously under Deng Xiaoping. So they were not taking on or confronting US frontally, right? So this sort of also aided thinking in the US to look at the short term and not look at China as this long term adversary. Yeah, it might happen, but it is uncertain. So let's put that on the back burner and focus on what we can do in the next 5 years. And that led to this US focusing on the short term, and there were conditions conducive for cooperation, right? So this is precisely what happened between US and PRC after the Sino-Soviet split. Now this benefited both the countries, and probably we can say it benefited China more. So that is what happened. One. Now look at the second phase. Okay, by 2010, sort of China's time horizon, it moved from this long-term focus to a short-term focus because it was ready to confront a lot of its neighbors. It sort of took up a lot of South China Sea disputes. So you had Vietnam, Japan, Philippines, all those things coming up. So it sort of signaled China's time horizons changing, and it was focusing on what can it do in the next 4 or 5 years rather than focusing on the next 15, 20 years, right? So when that happened, you had both the existing power and rising power focusing on the short term, right? So because by that time there was still after effects of 9/11, so US strategic thinking was still muddled up between whether it should focus on Afghanistan, Iraq, and or whether it should focus on China. So there was a mixture of skirmishes and pragmatic cooperation, which this framework also says. Now look at the third scenario, which is where we are now. And that, I guess I would roughly put it starting 2016, where where China is looking at the short-term horizon. It continues to do so like it did after 2010. But this realization that China is now continuing its arrogance against its neighbors, the BRI project and its attempts at influencing politics in countries such as Australia, also its rapid buildup of technological power, all those things combined to make an impression and change the US's time horizon, and it basically moved to a long-term horizon. So when an existing power focuses on a long-term horizon and current and rising power is actually focused on doing things now quickly, gaining power even if it ruffles the feathers of others, you actually have an increased possibility of a preventive war. That is what this framework said. So this is where I guess we are in now, where US is trying to take on China in various domains. It's not necessarily a war using force in the sense of armed forces alone, but it's a scenario where US is sort of confronting PRC directly, provocatively, on many domains such as trade and technology. So that's where I guess I would put it. Manoj, what do you think?
So I think this is really interesting because it's quite counterintuitive, right? I mean, the idea that the notion that's commonly been ascribed to the Chinese is that they think long term, and just rightly, like you said, that the criticism of American foreign policy is that because it thought short term in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and that's the criticism that Trump has sort of picked up on. And the idea that the Chinese are today thinking short term, I mean, I would agree with that also. I mean, what they've done in the South China Sea, what they've done in Hong Kong, particularly in the last 1 year, tells you that whether they see it as a short-term window of opportunity to act, or whether they see it as, the possibility of a long-term threat, and therefore you put up your defenses as strong as you can, is possibly what they are doing. The other interesting thing for me is that, from the Chinese perspective, I mean, all of us have written this, right? That what they've done right now over the last 3-4 years, particularly, has been damaging to their own long-term prospects, because they have quickened US thinking towards this rivalry, the US approach towards this rivalry. And the argument that the Chinese need to understand and alter their behavior over a period of time. I presume what my sense is what they're doing right now is that they're trying to figure out what are the advantages that within this short window of opportunity, and I don't know how they perceive when this window of opportunity will close, because if you listen to what Xi Jinping is still saying, he's saying that they will continue to act provocatively because they believe this window of opportunity still exists and it is soon to close. But whenever it potentially in their perception closes, or whatever that means, and I don't see that could mean as one moment, but there could be an event that could imply the closing of that window. That's when they will seek to establish status quo in behavior. Because if you listen to the messaging that's coming out from Beijing, it is, while they're doing certain things, they're also talking to the US about you must have a long-term view, you must have a long-term view. Their constant messaging to the US, apart from whatever they may be saying at the foreign ministry press conferences, arguing with the US about specific incidents, the general view is that the US must take a long-term perspective of ties with China, and the long-term perspective would then bring you back to negotiation, which is again runs counter to this particular framework, right? This particular framework says...
Yeah, in this framework, it would mean that long-term they would actually prevent the rise of China. But I guess long-term is always seen in a very positive mode, in a common parlance, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I presume that is what they're trying to do. And again, it would be fascinating to see what incident, event prompts them, or perhaps there will be multiple, which at different levels, with different countries. So, for example, perhaps the incident that's happening with India right now in Eastern Ladakh, if it worsens or if it stabilizes from here onwards, then we would probably see a year and a half from now this event as one of the sort of defining things that led to the PRC establishing a new status quo with India, whatever that status quo may be, and however it eventually comes out, something akin to sort of 1988. Or if it worsens from here on, then whatever the outcome of that worsening is, would be the new status quo, whether it's peaceful or whether it's more assertive and, friction, with greater friction. And likewise, there could be multiple others, right? Something with regard to Hong Kong differently, something in the South China Sea, something with regard to Taiwan, who knows? But I presume that's because if you see the messaging that's coming out from there, they're still seeing this as a short-term window of opportunity, which again contradicts this framework, that they're seeing it as a short-term window to do assertive things as opposed to look at cooperation. And in the long term is what they're looking at is cooperation potentially once this window closes. So again, which runs counter to this framework, which probably, Aditya, brings me to some of the criticism that you had of the framework, right? I mean, the idea that personalities could possibly play a role in all of this, right?
Yeah. The problem with limitation with any such political science work is that, if it is not focused on personalities, for example, it may not necessarily account for what happens when you have a specific leader who has short-term incentives. It sees the state as a monolith, whereas obviously we know that there are government actors, bureaucratic actors, and so on. So a leader may not necessarily have the same interest as the state. And so there might be good reason for a leader to do something that is not necessarily in the interest of his own state or her own state, but it's possible for such a person to engage in short-termism.
If I would add, Aditya, just to basically the short-termism of a leader might be different from a short-termism of a state. That's the sort of difference I would put. So, for example, this framework says that counter to this idea that statesmen or stateswomen actually think long-term and that's why they will be more peaceful. This framework actually says that's not true, because you will if an existing power is looking long-term, it is going to actually stop the rise of a rising power much earlier. But what Edelstein is saying, that actually if you focus on short term, there are more chances of cooperation, because you will end up looking at the opportunities gains now and then. But the problem I have with that is that's not necessarily the case, because if you have the short termism thinking of one leader, if they are only thinking about their own family or their own party or their own electoral outcomes, that might be very different from the short termism of their state. So they might actually end up confronting the other power for their own electoral gains rather than looking at the time horizon of the state. So you might have short-term confrontation rather than short-term cooperation, as this framework would argue.
Yeah, that's very well summarized. I mean, the only other minor criticism I'd have is he does go on about, he tries to make the case that buck passing, free riding behavior doesn't really exist. Free riding behavior is, hey, I'll let you balance against China. I'll let you spend blood and treasure. I'll just chill in the background. He's saying that doesn't really happen, doesn't make sense. I'm not sure that that's convincing, but where I think he's correct is that, buck passing can explain the absence of competition, but it can't explain the presence of cooperation. So, why do these so-called buck passing states cooperate? The reason they cooperate is because, as he points out, they're seeking that short-term, they're seeking short-term benefits in a very pragmatic way. There's one more thing about the book, which is, I think, something we should talk about, which is that he brings in intentions in a big way. Other realist scholars have also done that. Stephen Walt in The Origin of Alliances. But I think that's the big difference with Mearsheimer. So what he's saying is it's not just the capabilities that matter, but also the perceived intentions of another state. And both in his theory and his case studies, I think he makes a fairly good case of that. And there's another interesting concept that he brings up about intentions, which is how does a state gauge the intentions of another state? And he brings up this idea of a diplomatic litmus test. These would be diplomatic encounters, diplomatic tests that you would engineer in order to gauge what the other state really wants. Now, obviously, there are problems here. First of all, if the other state doesn't know it's being tested, it may not realize the consequences of what it's doing. Secondly, if it knows it's being tested, it can game you. So, a diplomatic litmus test is not necessarily perfect, but I think that even in recent years, you see examples of something that look like that. The Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling in the South China Sea, for example, or even India's bid to enter the nuclear suppliers group, are, I think, diplomatic events that serve as litmus tests to gauge the intentions of another country and perhaps convince enough members of your own elite, decision-making elite, that this is a long-term problem that we have to deal with.
Yeah, thanks, Aditya. Actually, what you said is very interesting. That it's not just power that matters in this framework. What they're saying is three things matter and actually empirically end up changing the attitude of the existing power to the rising power. One is, of course, power. The second one is perceived intentions, and the third one is time horizon. So it's like a function of these three variables. Yep. Rather than power alone, as offensive realists would argue. So that's interesting. Now, I had a question, Manoj, related to the current scenario. What I found interesting in this framework was that, like you were mentioning, this current preventive war scenario which is highly likely now, with US looking at long-term horizon, China looking at short-term horizon. The interesting part was when you put this as a 2x2, it says that, that is not inevitable. You can actually move to the other three quadrants as well, right? So if there is a rethink in PRC's approach, like you were saying, a shift to either of those remaining three quadrants is possible. Now, I want to ask you, with Xi Jinping at the helm, do you think it looks likely that there might be a shift there?
I mean, it looks terribly unlikely. Everything that has happened over the last 6-7 years, ever since he's taken charge, is essentially greater securitization of China's domestic and foreign policy, right? Everything, his perception has been driven by the sense of, in some ways, siege, which mixes with the sense of opportunity. And I think that creates that percolates down across the bureaucracy, across the military, across different branches of the party and the state. And that, to reverse that, you again need something which is I mean, either you need the leader himself to make this remarkable turnaround, which appears extremely unlikely, and to then sort of again percolate that down the system is going to be extremely difficult and a long-term process. It's not going to be an easy or peaceful process, as China's history itself tells us. And I don't see him doing that, because I think he views the world in a far more different sense than, say, his predecessors did. His worldview is that, and I think what's happened in the last couple of years with the US has cemented that. I mean, forget even couple of years, just the last 6-8 months, the change in American approach in response to, in many ways, what China has done, put in some ways ideology at the center of this competition with China. I mean, every speech that's come out of a senior American official over the last 6 months tells you that they see this competition with China increasingly from an ideological perspective. Yet there is a desire to find some sort of a cooperative framework towards the end of it, because, and I think that's not necessarily driven out of any. That's driven out of a sense of maybe to not engage in conflict, because conflict would be extremely costly, but also because of the deep economic linkages. So you will hurt yourself significantly. And I think to avoid that, I think if that sense of ideological conflict is what will further reinforce in the PRC and under Xi particularly, the sense of siege. And that then sort of continues to percolate down. And therefore, I don't see that China is sort of going to self-reflect, is going to, alter its approaches. I mean, if there was ever a time for this, one would have presumed it was happening in 2018 and 2019, when Xi Jinping started to open up this sort of strands of cooperation with India, with Japan, his sort of historic summit with Abe, the informal summit with Modi. That told you that they were trying to do something like that, realizing and therefore shifting a little bit. Yet what's happened in this year itself tells you that's not really working out, right? I mean, imagine, right, in the entire time this year, despite everything that's happened, Modi and Xi Jinping have not had a single conversation. Abe is now gone. You have a new Japanese leader. We're still waiting to see how that plays out. But I don't recall. I think maybe Abe and Xi Jinping also did not have a single conversation. Perhaps they might have had one. I'm not sure. But in comparison, China's approach to Europe has been far greater. So I don't see that he's also looking at creating what Aditya also referenced. I was reading Aditya's work that he talked about creating that sense of uncertainty within the US. To me, today, both sides have far greater certainty that they are locked in some sort of an ideological, some sort of a Cold War, if not they're locked in some sort of confrontation. And that is going to percolate. I don't see Xi Jinping sort of pivoting and changing all of that.
Yeah, I agree, Manoj. Even I feel so, in the sense that there are two orders of effects here, right? So if you look at 80s and 90s, the scenario we were in was, according to this framework, that US was looking at the short-term horizon and China was looking at the long-term horizon. And now what we are saying is it is in the exactly opposite camp, right? So where China is looking at short-term horizon, and because China is looking at short-term horizon, US is looking at long-term horizon. So even if, say, there was a power transition magically in Beijing and there was another leader who is actually moving back from the short-term focus to long-term, it also needs a second-order effect for US to also move its focus from a long-term horizon, which has now happened over the last 7-8 years, to again change and go back to the old time. So that looks unlikely, like one of these things can change, but for both to happen and for us to go back to the 80s and 90s era looks slightly unlikely. So maybe even if a power transition happens, there will be this mixture of cooperation and competition, but it looks unlikely that we'll have, that era where US was aiding and abetting China.
Yeah, I think that era is long past us. I think we are now, I think the best case outcome can be where again, both sides look at, as per this framework, both sides look at short-term, but sort of short-term horizons, but also in the context of, say, avoiding conflict, sort of avoiding moving towards conflict. And that's really tricky because there's now structural rivalry that's developed. And I think that is going to be very difficult to sort of walk back from. Aditya, any last thoughts?
Not really, except that we should I think it's fairly evident that India is also fits into the mold of an existing power. While it might be a rising power in its own right, it is losing relative power in relation to China, and so it's not surprising that India's own time horizons are lengthening.
It's interesting. I mean, would you see China behaving with India based on this framework, Edelstein's frameworks, behaving with India with a long-term view as opposed to a short-term view, whereas India again has periodically looked at China from a short-term perspective?
I think I'm not sure about this, but I think both might be looking at a long-term perspective right now, which is when both countries are looking long-term, it's not necessarily the best. If you look at the quadrant, I mean, when both countries look at the long term, it's an increased possibility of hegemonic war.
Okay. With that sobering thought, I think we'll call it a day. Thank you so much, Pranay. Thank you so much, Aditya. This has been a fascinating conversation.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, for supporting us. First, right off the bat, want to congratulate Ashton Doctor on celebrating the 300th episode of The Habit Coach. It's a great show. If you haven't been listening to it, listen to it now. And if you listen to it, you can almost go for an entire year with an episode a day. It's really fun. Do definitely check that out. Arjun Koladi, the head of sales for Spotify in India, was on Advertising is Dead. Do check that out. Really fun show. On Cyrus Says, we had Samit Basu, the author, fantasy author, one of my favorites. Definitely do check that out. It was Memorial Week this week on the IVM network. He was on Cyrus Says Cock and Bull on Thursday. He was on Litnama and, of course, his own podcast, Postcards from Nowhere. Do check that out. And one last note before we go. IVM Likes is back, and we've been doing a bunch of interesting conversations about different pop culture things that you might want to check out during the pandemic. Do give it a listen. I'm sure you'll enjoy that. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.